welcome to this panel on democratic backsliding. My name is Aaron Hoffman from SFU. I'm excited to have this panel and to hear what our panelists have to say. Just a couple of quick notes. Anyone who is interested in or who wants a live transcript of the comments, you can get that by clicking below. There's a little button that says live transcript. Also, I want to remind everybody that this session is being recorded. So if you do not want your face to be recorded on this session, please turn your cameras off. We'll be asking for those who will have questions while the speakers are speaking. You can certainly put those in the chat, and I will try to follow those and deliver them to the speakers at the end of their comments. Otherwise, we'll wait to the end to take audience questions. So with that, let me start by talking a little bit about the last several months in US politics. The last several months, and some people would say the last several years, US politics has been interesting in the worst sense of the word. In addition to confronting a range of normal international and domestic problems, as well as a global pandemic, observers say that the United States is also facing fundamental challenges to its basic democratic form of government. The most serious challenge to US institutions took place on January 6th of this year, when an angry mob breached the US Capitol building while the Congress was busy certifying the election of now President Joseph Biden. We have asked an all-star panel of to SFU today to consider the future of US democracy. And the question that they're going to be thinking about is, has the danger to the US democracy passed, or is the US going to be undergoing some form of democratic decline or backsliding towards authoritarianism over the next several years? I'm really pleased to hear what our panelists have to say. We have Jean Lachapelle with us. He's a research fellow at the University of Gothenburg's Varieties of Democracy Institute, where a lot of the leading research on democratic backsliding is taking place. His research examines the causes of state violence in authoritarian regimes. He's working on a book on the use of repression by autocrats based on in-depth fieldwork in Egypt and novel event data. And he is absolutely killing it in the journals with published or forthcoming work in the Journal of Politics, World Politics, and Comparative Politics. We are really honored to have him here. Dietlind Stolle is the James McGill Professor and Director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship at McGill University. She's an internationally sought-after speaker who won the 2016 Canadian Political Science Association Award for Teaching Excellence and the 2014 Canadian Political Science Association Award for the Best Book in Comparative Politics for her Cambridge University press book, Political Consumerism. Dietlind's publications appear in the best political science journals, Comparative Politics, British Journal of Political Science, and have been cited a ridiculous 16,000 times or more. She is currently working on a Shirk-funded grant with Elizabeth Giggendale on attitudinal democratic backsliding, and we are also really honored to have her with us. Last but not least, we have Stephen Saideman with us. He is the Patterson Chair in International Affairs at Carleton University's Norman Patterson School of International Affairs. He's also the director of the Canadian Defense and Security Network. Professor Saideman has an enviable publication record with 4 books, most recent one being a 2016 book on lessons from Canada's war in Afghanistan. There are also titles from Princeton University Press and Columbia University Press. Publications in leading journals such as the Journal of Politics, International Organization, and International Studies Quarterly. These articles have been cited more than 3,000 times, also an astonishing number. Professor Saideman has won fellowships from the Council on Foreign Relations and the Social Sciences Research Council. Earlier this week, he had an op-ed in the Globe and Mail about Canada's current defense minister. He's an expert on civil wars and civil military relations, and we are thrilled to have him and the other panelists with us. So thank you all for joining us. I am going now to step away from the microphone and pass the baton over to Jean Lachapelle, who's going to start us off on this question about democratic backsliding and what to expect in the US in the coming weeks and months and years. Jean?
Yeah, thank you very much for this introduction. I'm very excited to be here, and yeah, this is going to be great. So there are lots of reasons to be concerned about the health of American democracy. During the last election, we saw a president refuse to accept the electoral results. We've seen rioters storm the Capitol to try to overturn the electoral results. And we've seen a few years of efforts to undermine checks and balances. And these efforts did not succeed. Now there's a new president who's been elected, but the question remains, how fragile is American democracy still? And should we expect democracy to further deteriorate, or was this just a fluke, a temporary event? And maybe the fact that the previous president failed at overturning the electoral results signals some strength in the democratic institutions of the United States, because they were able to contain the threat. But at the same time, they were unable to prevent this threat from emerging in the first place. So these are very important questions that I'll address in this presentation. And to help answer these questions, I'm gonna try and place the US in a comparative perspective. So look at democratic backsliding more broadly, what the research tells us in general and about the US. So as Aaron already said, I'm a researcher at the VDEM Institute at the University of Gothenburg. My own research is mostly about authoritarianism, and I focus on politics in the Middle East. But I'm also, at VDEM, we do a lot of work collecting data cross-nationally to assess the state of democracy in the world. So this is what I'll be showing to you right now. And I will share my screen. And if that works, it should be okay. Okay, so to give you an idea of what the what we do at the Varieties of Democracy Institute is we try to find a better way to measure the quality of democracy in different countries. So it's an extremely difficult thing to do because democracy is ultimately democracy is something something extremely difficult to measure. And the idea is that we pool the knowledge of thousands of experts across the world who know very well some cases. Most of them are academics, they're academic researchers. And we ask them a battery of questions about several aspects of democracy in the country that they're expert in. And then we aggregate these data using some Bayesian statistical model that we developed. And then each year we release a new update of the data set along with a democracy report, which we released just last week, which is this one, entitled Autocratization Turns Viral, if people are interested. And so what does this tell us? So this allows us to look at which countries are declining in their democratic score and which countries are improving. So this map shows, highlights the countries that have experienced a significant either increase or decrease in their democracy score over the past 10 years. On the x-axis, this is the level of democracy in 2010. On the y-axis, it's the level of democracy in 2020. So if the countries that are on the diagonal saw no change, the countries that are above the diagonals show an improvement in their democracy score. So you see Tunisia, for instance, there. And the countries below the diagonal show a deterioration. And in the top right, you see that the USA experienced a significant decline, a noticeable decline. And at the top right, you can see, I can't point, and here's what it looks like when we look at the time series. So this is the US liberal democracy score since the 1950s. So you see there's an increase in democracy with the civil rights movement. And then starting in 2016, you see the sharp decline. And the question is this going to continue declining? Is this gonna improve? What are the tools that we can use to predict what's going to happen? So political science has produced an enormous literature on this topic of democratic backsliding. And I will only touch the surface, but there are two factors that are deemed particularly important for the stability of democratic regimes. First is political parties. So political parties have the ability to prevent authoritarians from rising, seizing power, and consolidating an authoritarian regime. And when parties are weak or parties are unwilling or unable to contain the threat from these authoritarians, there's a greater risk of democratic backsliding. And this is something that we see happening in a lot of countries. So looking at how healthy parties are in the US is an important first indication. Also, there's the level of political polarization, which is also very important. So when society is divided between antagonistic camps, some people might be willing to vote for leaders who have authoritarian tendencies. So what do the data tell us about these two aspects in the US is something that I'll be addressing in the next part of the presentation. So to assess the parties, last year at VDEM, we developed this new data set of political parties based on 665 country experts, and that covers the years since 1970. So basically for each party and election year, we asked a battery of questions about the party's rhetoric, its organization. It's all online, and there's a really nice code book online if people are interested. But this allows us to look at how American parties evolved over time in comparison to other countries, some of which did experience democratic backsliding. So that could be an indication of maybe that something is wrong. So we developed from these party measure an index of anti-pluralism, which, based on existing literature, is an indicator of poor commitment to democratic norms. So there's a literature in political science arguing that there are behaviors that are especially concerning when they're adopted by leaders or by parties, and there are in particular four indicators that we should look at. First, do parties recognize the legitimacy of their political opponents, or do they demonize them and argue that they are threats to the existing order? The second indicator is, do they recognize the democratic rules of the game? And for instance, when they lose election, do they accept to step down? Which is a very important core aspect of democracy. Third, do they abstain from supporting violence against their political opponents? And four, do they respect minority rights? And these are the questions from the, I'm not going to get into them, and they're aggregated into an index. And here's the result that we got that is quite interesting. So this shows how the Democratic Party and the Republican Party evolved over time on the anti-pluralism index, which is on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you can see parties' position on towards the economy, so whether they're more left or right. And there are other parties that are plotted from other countries. So you see, for instance, in the top right, there's the Bolsonaro's party in Brazil. So you can compare to other countries that have been backsliding also. And what's striking about this plot is you see a gradual increase of the Republican Party's anti-pluralism in its rhetoric, which is pretty dramatic in this plot. And you don't see an equivalent increase in for the Democrats. So this is something that is of concern because there might be other threats to American democracy that emerge in the future, and if the parties are not willing to defend core democratic norms, then we might experience democratic backsliding. So this is for parties, and I'll show you some new results about polarization. So there's a measure of polarization in our data set that basically asks this question: is society polarized into antagonistic political camps? And there's a so that's the question. These are the answers, and the data just came out last week, and this is what it gives, which is looks also quite dramatic. You see a very sharp increase in political polarization in recent years in the US that appears completely historically unprecedented. So this is something also that should be a great cause of concern. Of course, these data, they're aggregated at the country level. So there's a lot going on that they're not capturing, and that the other panelists will get into detail and be able to discuss. But these are two things that we should be concerned about because these are structural long-term changes that are hard to reverse and that are of concern. So in conclusion, yes, the US passed a major stress test and it's quite encouraging, but there's some structural vulnerabilities that still remain that must be taken into consideration. And one question is, what will have the effect of the pandemic been over the long term for democracy? And I think this is something that the other presentations will be able to speak to more, and because the impact has been very important, but very complex, and I think we're still analyzing it. And I think that I will let the other speakers speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. That was great. So now we'll turn it over to Dietlind Stolle from McGill. Dietlind.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Aaron, for bringing us together in this round. Thank you, Jean, for this very fascinating presentation. I'm not a US specialist, so I want to put this ahead, but I recently became interested in democratic backsliding, and as Aaron said, it's a shirk run together with Elizabeth Gedangle. And the major idea behind our work is that democracy is not a given, and not an even so-called established or stabilized democracies, and that has become blatantly clear lately. So let me share also my presentation at the moment. Yes, here we are. Yeah, is my presentation visible? Yeah. Okay, I only see Jean, yes, so yes. Jean, you are my reference point here. Yes, it is. Okay, so an important question not considered when we look solely at the institutional and leadership perspective that Jean just kind of presented to us is whether citizens view democracy or how citizens view democracy really matters. I want to justify looking at citizens for a moment. First, what interests us here is how do citizens react to institutional backsliding that they might experience? Do they simply accept it? Do they reject the ideas? And do they even recognize that democracy might be in danger? And do they care? So this perspective means that we consider public support for democracy somehow important. And there are, of course, classic authors I can refer to, but there are also newer ones who say so. But we can also just think, I think, about the single individuals on electoral commissions or on courts who held the fate of democracy in the US in their hands last fall. So I would even claim that it's not the institutions what saved American democracy. I would claim that the people within these institutions had leeway and discretion, and without their democratic commitment, we would have experienced potentially a different story. Of course, there's lots of counterfactuals here, so we can go into this in the discussion. In other words, democratic norms matter and can limit or encourage authoritarians in what they can do, and they can also strengthen the commitment of the opposition to fight any kind of downturns on democracy. Finally, because of the online connectedness of politicians to their constituencies, there's direct feedback between politicians and the public. So with all of this in mind, so let's see what the public in the US thinks, and let's conclude about the future of democracy in the US at the end. One larger question I want to ask for this panel is, do Americans accept or reject the erosion of democratic norms or institutions? Do partisans differ in their willingness to condone backsliding? Secondly, has the COVID pandemic strengthened the acceptance of backsliding? And thirdly, are young people more open or resistant to the ideas of democratic backsliding? So let's start with an overview graph. And the first part here you already saw with Jean about the development of liberal democracy. I think it is using also the VDEM index here on the left, the black line, but plotted against is the public support for democracy that declined over the last decades from 90% to 80%. It has been, or 82%. It has been, relatively stable, relatively high, a little bit lower than in other countries. On the right, Foa and Monk claim there is less commitment amongst young people. However, we believe that these general survey questions about support for democracy are not as meaningful. First, they are very abstract questions. They're asking about a very abstract concept of democracy that people don't usually think about all the time. Second, we cannot successfully distinguish those who criticize democracy for various reasons from those who don't care. And third, and most importantly, we would most likely overestimate the support. And we can also go into this in the Q&A of why this is so. So with my co-authors, Elizabeth Gedengel and Olivier Bergeron-Boutin, I believe that we need to study democratic support by citizens more concretely. With specific scenarios, with vignettes and experiments. We also believe we need to break down backsliding into its constituent parts. For the purpose of this presentation, I like to zoom in on executive aggrandizement as one of the most pernicious forms of democratic backsliding. The executive basically slowly attempts to remove checks on executive power and to invalidate institutional norms along the way. It is a special form of backsliding because it's so gradual, it's hidden, and often full of what Nancy Bermeo calls vexing ambiguities. And it's ambiguous because the steps taken towards backsliding are taken by democratically elected leaders within the democratically established institutions, but they often abuse the democratic norms. So let's start with our first approach, the scenario approach. So I will give you a glimpse of our work, but then also trace it back to our overall question here. When we ask such specific questions, as you can see here, about some scenarios of executive backsliding that present politicians' behavior, and we are trying to go beyond the cheap approval of democracy in survey questions that are maybe easier to just say yes to. Do people accept these scenarios or not? So here are just some examples of kind of scenarios that we collected together to an index in a survey in the US in 2018. And we see here on this slide that the support, when it comes to that support as a juxtaposition to the general support of democracy, is relatively high. And so here, for example, we see that about 30 to 35% of Americans in our sample support executive aggrandizement. In some cases, these were blatantly undemocratic scenarios, as you have seen in the kind of slide before. On the right here, we see the propensity of different partisans to condone executive aggrandizement. And that's related to Jean's earlier point in his presentation. That is a pretty consistent finding that we have, that Republican partisans are much more in agreement that it is okay if the executive is abusing his or her power. And that finding is consistently at the individual level, especially when we use these kind of scenarios of backsliding. Of course, we must ask the question why this is the case. And in our follow-up work, we do look into it. And with a comparative design using also Canada, we conclude that it has not so much to do with the executive party who is just in power that that could be one reason of why Republicans are so much more supportive. But also along the lines of Jean's conclusion, we conclude that it has to do with the mobilization of the party leaders of the Republican Party that have kind of made this kind of support for executive aggrandizement so important. So the conclusion is that the openness to support executive aggrandizement is not insignificant, but that there are some partisan differences. However, these partisan differences become smaller when respondents have to make choices or trade-offs. And in order to come really close to actual behavior and to explore how democratic and undemocratic stances of politicians matter vis-a-vis some of their policy positions, we conducted a candidate choice experiment. I don't have time to really go into it, but basically what we've done is we present respondents with different attributes of politicians, always two politicians that are being compared. Some of them are about their democratic norms and others are about their policy stances, and we let people vote. And when we use policies that really matter to Democrats, such as abortion, for example, it turns out that Democrats also support an undemocratic candidate when there is only when there's only a candidate available that supports the abortion policies but also happens to be undemocratic. So basically, in conclusion, this means that policy stances are trumping democratic stances, and that scenario, these kinds of scenarios, are also influencing Democrats. Of course, we can be lucky that Democrats in reality didn't have to make a choice between candidates who are democratic and not, and who have different policy stances, but it is kind of tapping into the potential of the public to accept executive aggrandizement. So the question we asked last year is whether the acceptance of executive aggrandizement is affected by what is happening under COVID. And Jean made also reference to that. So one big factor here is that existential and debilitating anxiety really directly affects the support for democratic backsliding, as we have a lot of evidence for that. But anxiety is also pushing people to accept policies, particularly lockdown policies, for example, that can calm and address people's fear. In our 2020 survey, we introduced a vignette experiment describing a governor who either wants to open businesses again to stimulate the economy, although the infection rate is high, or a governor who wants to continue the lockdown, although the infection rate is slowing. In both scenarios, we have a state legislature contradicting the governor. The question is whether the governor should shut down the legislature, which is basically shutting them down because he or she wants to press his or her policies. It's a clear example of executive aggrandizement, and we have different party ideas that the governor can take on. I don't have time to go into the details, but I just want to say that one of our results shows here that COVID anxiety, so being really very anxious about COVID, and it is raising the chance that people allow the governor to shut down the legislature in order to protect their desired COVID policy, which is the lockdown policy. As you can see here, the higher anxiety on the right, the higher the decision for the shutdown, no matter what the policy proposal is of the governor. In fact, when we look at those who strongly prefer a lockdown policy, here a lockdown policy until a vaccine is found, here to the people presented to the very right, these are also the people who are more anxious. Their support for the shutdown climbs to 80%. In other words, it's okay to trample on the norms of democracy as long as the governor supports and holds on to the lockdown policy people prefer. Again, we also confirm this result with our candidate choice experiment in COVID times, and also with abortion, the lockdown policies really matter here. In other words, COVID has made the public in the US much more prone to accept undemocratic policies, and that is also not just a result due to the US, it's a general result in other countries as well. So my last point here is about looking into the future by looking at the young generation. Young people are the carriers of democratic ideas and norms that will the US will depend on in the next decades. And in some ways, our results are not as encouraging, but more research is really warranted before we can draw general conclusions. Here we see that younger cohorts are really more supportive of our executive aggrandizement scenarios compared to older cohorts here. There can be several reasons for this. I will go into this in the Q&A. But even also for so these are direct questions, right, about executive aggrandizement scenarios. They are not general support questions for democracy. In our vignette as well about the governor, younger people are more inclined to allow the governor to shut down the legislature. In many of our other questions and experiments, we see cohort differences that also point in the same direction. And we think it is worrisome because it asks about particular scenarios, not just general support. Of course, there could be life cycle effects going on. But one big reoccurring issue is that younger cohorts don't know how to distinguish a democratic executive action from an undemocratic one. So the democratic knowledge is not there. And here is, we see why this is the case. When asked about recognizing whether a situation is democratic or not, so now it's not about approval, but asking the respondents about whether a particular scenario is democratic or not, we see actually strong cohort differences. We ask 8 such democratic knowledge questions. And in fact, the youngest cohort in the US is in the worst position to determine whether a situation is democratic or not. In our research, we show that this kind of knowledge is key in turning against democratic backsliding. So, what's the story here? I summarized the results of our research in this last slide, but overall I want to say that US democracy is certainly not dying, not for the lack of trying, however, but it has come close. Democratic norms of several actors seemed important to prevent a breakdown. The institutions were not protecting the potential breakdown. It was always in the realm of the playing field of the institution that these norms really played a role. However, people are, according to our research, relatively acceptant of undemocratic executive behavior, and I would call this situation vulnerable. Republicans are more so than Democrats accepting of these behaviors, but there is a vulnerability also for Democrats when they really want to push through certain policies that they would potentially trade that with some sort of cuts around the corner on democratic values, at least according to our research. It might be some things that we see play out in reality now when it goes to the struggle of the Voting Rights Act and whether there might be democratic compromises, for example, to be made. However, the fact is that polarization, as Jean said, paired with a leader who plays with fire and promotes undemocratic norms and conventions can be a dangerous mix and has left a dangerous trace in our population in the US. And so I would argue that democracy has lost a constituency or some part of the constituency during the last years, and it makes the US more vulnerable in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dietlind. That was terrific. Now I want to turn it over to Steve Saideman. Steve? Steve, are you there? Oh, there you go. Okay, perfect.
It's only been a year and we're still talking while muted. Hopefully democratic habits are as enduring as our habits of not unmuting ourselves. Hopefully undemocratic habits are easier to, we can fix. So what I want to do is briefly talk about the civil relations of this. I want to thank Jean and Aaron and Dietlind for being here today and being so smart. Hopefully my lack of numbers will not make me look quite as ad hoc as it appears. But what I want to do is just talk about the U.S. case a little bit and some of the positive pieces of it that people are overlooking, and then some of the negative pieces and where we're going to be at for the time being. So the good, what was interesting about the conversations that Jean and Dietlind had thus far is that they didn't use the word armed forces or military at all. And that wasn't just that they were trying to be nice to me and making sure that they didn't step on my toes. It was because in most of those countries that were on the wrong side of Jean's line, the armed forces played no role in the backsliding. The one example that comes closest would be Turkey, which I'll get to a little bit. But I've got pictures here of Viktor Orban, Modi of India, and our friend Donald Trump. And in none of those cases of democratic backsliding war, there was a military, a force pushing the country down the road away from democracy. That this has been a party thing, and it has been a voter thing, but it has not been a military thing. And so when we take a look at the US armed forces, they played no role in pushing the United States away from democracy. And there's some people who would say, but wait, there's January 6th, that was a coup. And I will stand firmly on this hill that that people tried to kill me on, which is that January 6th was not a coup. It was not an attempt by part of the armed forces or other security apparatus to overthrow the existing government of the United States. It was a group of people, including militias, but not the government, not the military, who sought to stop the election processes and keep the person in power who is currently in power. There were individuals from the U.S. Armed Forces and various police forces around the country, as well as Republican politicians, but there were not any units from the U.S. military. The controversy about the U.S. military that day was, why did they show up? Why did they not show up to deal with the situation? And that answer lies not in the hands of the U.S. military. It lies in the hands of the acting Secretary of Defense, who is a civilian. So there was the U.S. military did not refuse orders. The U.S. military did not exceed its authority. The U.S. military didn't really do anything. And there is a literature in civil military relations about whether the military leaves the barracks or not when they're asked to put down protests. But even that wasn't really a thing here, because again, the U.S. military was not really asked to do anything. And so therefore it didn't have a choice. And when they were ultimately given the authority to act, elements of the National Guard did act. So the U.S. military did not participate in the insurrection. It was not a coup. The bad. There are lots of people, in between November and January going, hey, what about the military? Maybe they can stop this. And the answer is democratic militaries can't stop backsliding. That's not their job. They have no power to do it. And trying to do so would actually be far worse than them doing something. That they don't have the capacity to do that. They're not, the United States military and the militaries of most modern democracies are not major political actors whose voices need to be heard in order to direct behavior, right? The comparison I would make between the year 2000 and 2020 is that nobody in 2000 asked about Gore versus Bush, how many hanging chads are enough? Or what should the Supreme Court do? Nobody asked the military about that at all. This time around, there are some people saying, hey, what's the military's role in that? Which is bad. Not that the military can't stop backsliding. That you can say that's good or bad or whatever, but asking them to do so is bad for civil relations because it's making the military an adjudicator of elections, and that's not their role in democracies. And so that is a vital norm that wasn't violated directly, but people started talking about. And that's a problem because the first step along the way to having bad things happen is to imagine them. And you had people imagine things and actually, write op-eds and talk on the radio and TV and say, the US military should be getting involved in this. The answer is no, the military had no role in it. And the military itself said, we have no role in this. It's not our job. Our job is to protect the Constitution. Now, what we are learning now is that the folks who swear an oath to the Constitution in the military may not understand what that document means or says. And that's a challenge for the literacy of soldiers and civilians. but it's not the job of the U.S. military to stop a backsliding situation. And now I'll explain the picture of Erdogan, who is leader of Turkey. And that was where a coup attempt by folks opposed to Erdogan launched a coup attempt, and that gave Erdogan the excuse to gut Turkey's democracy further. So coup attempts can facilitate backsliding, but the backsliding that's happened in Turkey, again, was not led by the military. The military is not a force for repression, per se. It's the civilians who are undermining Turkish democracy. That was happening before the coup, and it was probably accelerated after the coup. So coup attempts, again, not good for backsliding. The ugly. I've got two pictures here. One is from last summer, and one is from January 6th. And they both help to speak to the erosion of norms of civil-military relations. From the very start of the Trump administration, Trump was eroding, well, most norms of American politics, but the ones I care about today are the ones of civil-military relations. First, he appointed a retired military officer to be Secretary of Defense. Before Jim Mattis was named Secretary of Defense, that happened one time, and that was Secretary of Defense George C. Marshall, who happened to have been Secretary of State before he became Secretary of State of Defense. And that was a kind of an emergency situation given the events of the time. So the first major appointment, even before Trump became president, helped to erode some of the norms of American civil relations. And then throughout his presidency, he constantly spoke to military audiences in a very partisan fashion, trying to prop up his presidency and the popularity of the American military. Because the American military, like most democratic militaries, is one of the most popular institutions in the country. Why? Well, actually, because it's not partisan. Everybody can love the country's military because it's not identified as Republican or Democratic, liberal or conservative or NDP, Christian Democrat or social Democrat in Western European democracies. So militaries tend to be popular because they're not tainted by partisanship. And then Trump tried to taint it with partisanship. Many speeches where he was attacking his adversaries, and arrayed behind him were soldiers and sailors and aviators who could not do anything besides stand there. And he regularly lent the legitimacy of the military to his policies. It's not an accident, for instance, that Trump signed the original Muslim ban to prevent immigration of Muslims to the United States at the Pentagon, with Jim Mattis standing behind him. So there was also much discussion about whether Trump would get his parade, and he eventually got a modest parade, but wasn't quite the same thing. But over the course of the 4 years, he steadily referred to my generals, and they're not his generals, and all the other things that he did to undermine the norms of American civil military relations. So the American civil relations are in trouble, but not because they're trying to launch a coup. Now, what happened on January 6th made obvious what was kind of known but not really widely discussed, that North American countries, or at least two of them, I don't know about Mexico, but the United States and Canada both have a white supremacy problem in their military. We've seen the Proud Boys, a Canadian organization, have events in Canada involving people who are in the military. And we saw on January 6th, an event that was dripping in white supremacy involve a variety of folks from the US military, from the National Guard, from police forces. And so we are now more aware of white supremacy in the American military and in veterans. And that's a problem. And we should remember that the Oklahoma City bombing was committed by Timothy McVeigh, who was a veteran and was in these far right-wing associations. So this is not new. Extremist organizations often want to join military so they can learn how to kill people more effectively and other skills they get from the military, and B, they want to infiltrate these organizations so that way if these organizations are used against them, then they can then have them infiltrated, which has all kinds of advantages such as early warning of raids and such. So we now understand better today that white supremacy is a real problem in the American military. And again, the Canadian military, we can't get too cocky about this. And what we also have seen over the past 4 or 5 years, and beyond that, but particularly the past 5 years, is that these militias, these extremist organizations, these terrorist groups have increasingly donned the uniforms or of military-looking things. So if you looked at this picture, the one at the bottom, you know, without knowing the larger context, you'd say, okay, well, what are these soldiers doing in this event? And they're not soldiers; they're oath keepers. They're part of a far-right violent organization aimed at essentially overthrowing the United States government, replacing it with something far worse. But they are deliberately taking on the uniforms. And actually, it's not just them. You take a look at modern policing. We see modern policing dressing folks up like they look like special operations officers. So this is a larger problem where lots of folks are wearing military gear in ways that sort of blur the boundaries between the U.S. military, which again is one of the highest esteemed institutions in the country, with everybody else, or not everybody else, but lots of people that we don't want to be seen in the same light. So this is going on. So where does this leave us? Well, the good news is there's no coups down the road, but there's no cavalry coming either. That is that the military is not going to overthrow the government, but the military is not going to save us either. And so we shouldn't expect it to do so. And so what should we do? Well, we should reinforce the norms of civil-military relations. I wrote a lot in the run-up to the Biden administration opposing the appointment of Lloyd Austin as Secretary of Defense because he is a recent retired general, and we've already had enough of that. What's striking about the moves that he's made since, leading up to becoming Secretary of Defense and since then, is that Lloyd Austin has done his best to try to reinforce the other norms of civil-military relations. So his team around him are all civilians, they're not retired military types, whether that's Catherine Hicks or Cullen Call, who is currently, his nomination is being held up in the Senate. These are folks who are not people with military backgrounds. And so he's trying to reinforce that norm in a different way. And the way he's speaking and the way he's talking about the military, and the way actually Biden is talking about the military is different than Trump, trying to reinforce those old norms. But like everything else, it's far easier to destroy a norm than to build one. And so this is going to take time and it's going to take repetition. The other thing that the United States military can do in the next few years to help safeguard American democracy is to address its own white supremacy problem. It can also address its own misogyny problem, but the misogyny problem is related to the white supremacy problem, but it's not the same thing. The white supremacy problem is more focused on destroying American democracy, whereas the misogyny problem is not quite as deliberate, I think, in that way, but I could be wrong about that. It's important to note that misogyny, homophobia, white supremacy, anti-Semitism all travel together. So if you attack one, you probably will be attacking most of them anyway. But the key is that the American military, just like American police forces, need to deal with the white supremacy problem. That would do a lot to advance the cause of American democracy. The original figure that Jean put up about the rise of American democracy and the decline, I can't help notice that the late 1960s, early 1970s were sort of where American democracy got better. And that happened to be at the same time as the civil rights movement. That was a way to improve American democracy. And that white supremacy in the past and very much in the present is one of the threats to American democracy. That these folks are challenged because in the old days they didn't mind democracy because they were far ahead the majority, and now they are losing their position because yes, there is some demographic change, and the only way for them to deal with that is to get rid of that inconvenient democracy part of it. And now I'm really straying far from civil military relations, so I'll end my discussion here, and I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to hearing from more smart things from Dietlind and Jean. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Although you ending on the slide of the Star Wars prequels makes me very worried about the future of democracy. Such a terrible movies. But anyway, two questions came through on the chat, which I'll put to the panel. I'll also ask those who are interested in asking questions now of our panelists to either put them in the chat or to raise your hand somehow. Let me know that you're interested in speaking. The first question came through about populism. And the question was, is populism a probable contributor to democratic backsliding, or is it a consequence of democratic backsliding? That's question number one. And then question number two is it possible that if respondents, I think this is a question directed more at Dietlind, but if respondents, Democrats or Republicans, might have the Trump administration as a referent, at least implicitly, accounting for the differential support to the questions that you asked. So would Republicans, do you think Republicans would have been less supportive of an authoritarian leader under a Biden presidency? So we'll go with that.
Okay, so you want us to respond directly here?
Yes.
Yeah. On the first question about populism and backsliding, a very important question that we also have on our mind. If we think about the structural problems of democracy that the US has had with representation, that only 50% of its population is voting, unequal representation, that policy preferences are not directly translated into policies and at the state of government and so on. And many, many others, the dissatisfaction that has developed with how democracy is functioning, which is not yet backsliding, has been used by, or can be used by, populists all over the world, I think, and be mobilized. And that's where populists tap in and come in. And so at the end, in our opinion research, we do see a very strong correlation between populist sentiments that we try to measure as focusing on the elite people division, right? And that people are always right and elites are to be criticized and so on. So if we use that and our backsliding measures, we do see a very, very strong correlation. In fact, the people who most strongly subscribe to populist sentiments are also the ones who would support mostly these backsliding measures. So that's how much I want to say about question one. I'm sure that Jean has a lot more to say about that. And then also about the question posed by Laurel in the chat, whether people had the Trump administration as a reference point in mind. We were also worried about that. And in our kind of revising of our survey questions and repeating of the design, we ask this much more generally. We ask not about a president, we ask about presidents or prime ministers and so on. I mean, and ask just, whether people thought that it's wrong of a prime minister or president to dissolve the legislature or to insist on certain policy or veto certain policy proposals that have been already accepted by a 2/3 Senate and so on. So without referring directly to the American situation, we still find the same patterns of research. We also tested whether it is about the party in power, as I said before. So we tested this, for example, in Canada, whether the Liberals would be also much more prone to promote executive aggrandizement because their politician is in power at the moment, and we didn't find any relationship there at all about who is in power in the Canadian context, and so on. Rather, what we do find is that the strong support of Trump and Trump approval and the messaging that Trump sends out has made people more acceptant of these scenarios of democratic backsliding.
Thank you.
Yeah, I might have a few words to say about the populism question. Thank you, Dietlind. If I might ask very quickly. So we did collect data on populism distinct from the other. Say, if I might show very quickly. So we have this this chart here. So we see that Republicans also became used more of a populist rhetoric also, and Democrats a little bit. But less so than the Republicans. And so I thought that was also an interesting finding. And I found the question extremely difficult to answer. So is it a cause or a consequence? So it's tempting to punt and to say that it's probably both. And that, I mean, populism, if there's a lot of frustration towards the elites, then it makes it tempting for people to vote for a candidate who will clean politics. And so it's definitely a cause, and it's probably also a consequence, because once these autocrats are in power, they try to further instill people's frustration with the elites in order to stay in power. So it probably goes both ways.
Thank you. Max Clark has your hand. You have your hand up. Please, what's your question?
Yeah, so obviously, polarization is one of the biggest driving factors behind increasing the contempt that the two political parties' supporters have for one another, and hence their support for non-democratic actions. And I was just wondering, in terms of the causalities of polarization, would you all say that polarization is sort of more caused by the leaders in these parties? Is it like a top-down process, or is it the voters' preferences or voters being polarized themselves, which therefore has an impact on how party leaders act?
Is that question directed at a particular panelist, or just is it for everybody?
For everybody.
I have opinions about this, but you guys have data, so I'll let you guys go
A
first.
stumper.
Well,
Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think the polarization in the United States has been led by the politicians, because it precedes 2008. It precedes the financial crisis. It precedes a lot of things that it really starts, in my mind, in the 1990s with Gingrich becoming leader of the Republican Party. In fact, if not in name, that his contract with America. I called it the contract on America, but that's me being biased. His stances were about refusing to compromise and about taking the fight to the Democrats in ways that weren't really part of normal politics before. And we saw that in shutdowns of the government over budget fights. We saw that with the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And so all those things were about the parties growing apart, and particularly the Democrats weren't really moving far away from where they started. It was the Republican Party going increasingly right wing, further and further right wing, making more populist appeals. And part of that was that for both parties, the seats got safer over time through gerrymandering on both sides. And for the Republicans, that meant that elections became an outbidding competition about who can be more enthusiastic about being less compromising. And that was a development that was going on throughout the 2000s. Remember that Mitch McConnell swore in 2009 that he would not help Obama be successful, even if it was at the cost of the country. And so the Republicans stopped playing by the rules. And so it was really a Republican thing. And then 2016, the presidential campaign was an ethnic outbidding event where you had 20 candidates, and the one who was making the most outlandish claims about being the best at repressing, at banning Muslims and targeting Mexican Americans and all the rest of it, got more votes. He didn't get a majority of the Republican vote in 2016, but Donald Trump was the tallest Oompa Loompa. He was the guy who stood out because he was a big name and because he was willing to say things that nobody else was. And the rest of the party mostly didn't confront him because they want to lose the vote of the far right of the party. And over the past 4 years, I think that whatever moderate Republicans that existed have left, and the party's become a pure Trumpier form of the party. And we're seeing that where Republicans at this moment in time can say Joe Biden is president, but they cannot say that Joe Biden won the presidency through normal electoral processes. So the party has become something that evolved over time. So I think it was led by elites, and then they got captured by it. Maybe the Tea Party movement of 2009, 2010 made a difference in sort of giving Republicans clues about where to go. And maybe now that the version of the variant of that now is the QAnon folks. But it was started by the Republican Party pandering to the worst instincts of people, in my opinion, and Fox News.
I also want to add here that I agree with Steve's assessment that it is a elite-driven process. Some academics also talk about the asymmetric polarization that started with the Republican Party and became really blatant during the Obama years. But it's a process that started before and ended or culminated, of course, with the Trump election. But before that, also with the refusal to hear Obama's the hearing for Obama's candidate for the Supreme Court. And so on. I mean, there were certain significant events that pushed polarization farther, but we do see a similar post-developments in the population that are frightening, and in the sense that now Republicans as well as Democrats regard the people from the other party as threats, and that the situation that when the other party is in office as a threat to America. And what worries me most is the recent work by Lily Manson from Maryland, who shows very clearly the readiness, and that's also a Brightline Watch outcome, by the way. Brightline Watch people also have the same, the readiness of both Democrats and Republicans to accept political violence in various situations when people of the other party, for example, don't accept election results or kind of protest in certain ways, that there should be retaliation, and the violence toleration is extremely high and culminated on January 6th. So violence begets violence. So that's a really dangerous level of polarization, and I think it's the task of the Democratic Party, who is in office, to work and to reach out and to really work on polarization. That is, I think, the foremost goal to keep American democracy safe, to work on this polarization issue in the population as well as amongst politicians.
These last two comments tie in with a bunch of questions that we have on the chat about the role of information, misinformation, and messaging, and how they can potentially contribute to Democratic backsliding. So on the one hand, we have some people like Jessica Birch and Corey Henderson who are asking about social media and misinformation. We have a question about whether the passing of Rush Limbaugh is going to make a difference here, as well as a question by Marcus Macaulay about whether a change in kind of rhetoric from the Biden administration might make things better, at least in the short term. I'll put that to Jean or to anyone who wants to answer. But yeah.
Yeah, there's no doubt that social media and these media bubbles, these environments where people are exposed only to people who have the same opinion, and is detrimental to democracy right now. And one interpretation of one of the plots that I showed that showed the increasing polarization in the U.S. over time, that it starts really spiking when you see social media. So it's a correlation, maybe, but there clearly there's a role there.
Just to go with what Dietlind was saying for a second, she was saying, well, Biden, the Democrats have to deal with the polarization. I'm like, but actually, if you think about what Biden has been doing, there's been a couple of things they've been doing, and part of it fits in the media and part of it fits to policy, which is if you actually govern on behalf of the entire country, that might make a dent. I hope it makes a dent. But the fact that Biden's policies are widely popular, he's not really governing as a far left president. The COVID relief bill is widely popular, and most of the things he's supporting are not like 51% to 49% popular. They're 60 to 70% popular. And so if he continues to govern like that, that will help. It will not get rid of the 20% of the American people who are you can substitute your own adjectives, but it will get, if he governs in ways that have policies that help most Americans, then I think that'll take a little bit of the edge off. The other thing that he's doing, which he's getting a lot of grief for, is he hasn't been putting everything up, he hasn't been stamping everything with his name, right? Trump made everything about Trump. Biden's trying to make everything about, other people and about the country. And so he hasn't been doing press conferences. Well, why? Well, in part, he wants the vaccine not to have his name on it, because if it has his name on it, then people on the right aren't going to take it. And if the relief bill has his name all over it, it's going to have his name on part of it. But if it has all over it, then it's not going to play out as well. And so he's trying to depersonalize American politics. And so that's part of an effort, I think, to try to deal with this polarization problem. Because, you know, if you go back to Obamacare, if you asked American people from 2012 to 2019 whether they like the American Care Act, they'd be like, that's great. And then they ask them if you like Obamacare, which is the same thing, then you have the American people who hate it. And so I think that might be something that Biden is trying to do in terms of the media environment.
Right, and I just want to add that it is so important to address this issue of polarization in the context of the homogeneous bubbles on social media, because not only are we polarized more, but there's also more social sorting going on. That is, that if you vote for the Republicans or Democrats, that the social attributes become more and more separated. There are fewer and fewer layers of intersection between those two different groups in terms of race, in terms of religion, and certain degrees, sometimes also gender, but race, religion, and region are really the kind of separating factors that pull these two electorates even farther apart. So if social media strengthen the homogeneity, you know, that there is really no communication between them. So any kind of political leader in office now needs to open up this communication, needs to find issues that are interesting to the electorates of both sides in order to overcome the polarization, to work on those issues together. And of course, one of them could be inequality, but we can go into this later, what kind of issues we think might be these overarching issues. I also want to say a few things about education, as some questions have been posed about the role of education. Education is always an important factor that leads to better democratic knowledge, so we do something right in college, thank God, and also to general rejection of democratic backsliding. Is this now our kind of policy that we want to push? Is a question, I mean, that we have been talking about decades about better civic education. It is simply not happening. People don't hear, or students don't hear about, pupils in school don't hear about the consequences of if you don't have democracy in other countries. Maybe that was a little easier during the Cold War, but it's not happening. How children, young people what they lose out if they don't experience democracy. So these are the kinds of issues we should probably focus on more, but I definitely don't think that's the only solution here to our problem. It's not just the civic education, but it is to address how democracy can be useful for the young generation, for example, more generally in our political actions. That would be much more important than the civic education about it.
Perfect, thank you. I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. Let's go to Steve Weldon and then see where we are.
Hi, thanks very much. The presentation is very interesting. You know, I look at your data and the results that were presented by Jean and Dietlind and things said by Steve, and I look at this, and I want to push you a little bit more on this because it was discussed a little bit, and anyone can answer this, is this idea of asymmetric polarization. Like, we use this terminology, polarization, just generally, which implies like everyone's at fault. And I think that kind of, we feel better about ourselves when we both sides an issue, right, to some degree. But I look at this and I think, well, okay, it seems to me your own data suggests that it's, from your analysis, what you've presented is that it is really on the right side primarily. There is a big difference between a 0.2 and a 0.45 probability of supporting non-democratic norms. You think back to when Obama was in charge, Steve was talking about this, the rise of the Tea Party. It's like you have an actual moderate policy president that sees the rise of the Tea Party. And that argument was based on, well, it's a reaction against race. I think one of the questions Marcus Macaulay put into the question is like, well, okay, that's interesting. Like, we know that, but what happens when Biden starts saying like, oh, we govern for everyone, would we expect to see Republican partisans become more anti-democratic as a result of that? So we've now controlling for race as a candidate. I think these are some really important questions, because I think there's a big difference about how we approach this problem and what we think about the risks to society and democracy if it's asymmetric particularly on the right side. And I don't think this is specific to the US either. This is, I mean, you look across Europe, there's a more of a tendency to want to I think look at left-wing populism and throw it into the same sort of basket as right-wing populism, but there's very little evidence that they are in fact the same type of anti-democratic. There is a big difference between radical right that is anti-minority, anti-political community, and versus what the left is. And I even think to myself when I see the data that Dietlind put up, is like, well, yeah, I mean, sometimes you have to ask yourself, is democracy the best solution if Mitch McConnell is using the system to undermine, veto rights and minority rights? And we're seeing all this stuff on like eliminating or cutting back on ease of voting right now that's happening just in the first 2 months. It's hard to look at that and say like, should I be supporting this? Is this legitimate democracy in some ways? So I think I fall quite on the side of, obviously, if you couldn't tell, but that it is asymmetric, mainly on the right, and that is actually the real threat to democracy. And I think that I'd be kind of curious as your perspectives about how we can kind of deal with it. Thanks.
I think these are very important points, Steve, and I agree, and we have said so, I think, and Steve has said so particularly, that there has been a lead in to this asymmetric polarization at the leadership level from the right. But the question is, how do people deal with it now? I mean, if the conclusion of these affronts against democracy is that we should also use similar style techniques and strategies to counter, the power of Republicans and to kind of manifest our own goals in a similar kind of way, I think that would be highly dangerous for the survival of democracy. So that's, I think, why we need to look at both sides right now and to understand what the readiness is of both sides to agree to these kinds of scenarios. So that's why I think this question is so important. And we do see, and I haven't shown that data here, for example, for goals such as to protect the climate and the environment, that people on the left are really going far out to use undemocratic means to go that route. And that is what I think could be so dangerous, and a dangerous outcome of this episode in American history and politics that we have just experienced, that these kinds of strategies become more legitimized and more, potentially to use. And the other thought here is about left-wing populism that you made. I'm sure Jean can talk about that, but of course, we do know variants of left-wing populism that are also highly undemocratic from Latin America, for example. And so it is not clear that there is a clean political division globally anyway. We haven't seen this combination in the US context of a left-wing politician who kind of wants to get away with democratic norms, but we have seen it globally. Jean, maybe.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there's nothing that prevents a left-wing party to be highly populist and to erode democratic norms. It is true that nowadays we see more of these right-wing parties, especially in Europe, in the United States. But as Dietlind mentioned, there are some really prominent cases, for instance, in Venezuela, where it's a very similar process that has happened, like depolarization, instrumentalization of polarization by some rising autocrat, and it was all left-wing politics. So there's nothing intrinsically that prevents left-wing populism from being as threatening. So I guess one interesting question is, why does the realization or the manifestation of this populism in the 21st century tends to be more right-wing in its like manifestations? And but I don't have a very good answer to this question, but it's definitely something investigating. But I don't think we should. I think it's actually potentially a little dangerous to equate populism with conservatism or right-wing politics. It's something that we should always be aware of.
The one I've been railing against false equivalence machines, which seem to be operating at full speed at the New York Times. There's an effort by media outlets to try to portray both sides as being equally something. And the problem is that right now we have one party that's trying to deny people the right to vote. Another party actually trying to expand the vote to everyone. I kind of think one of those ways is better, and one of those ways is destructive to democracy and an abomination. And the Democrats, the Republicans have been trying to win elections by changing the rules in ways that limit the franchise. I've always thought that it was, the greater risk was not, oh no, one person engaged in voter fraud, but oh, one person was denied the right to vote. I always thought the right to vote was more important to protect. And we know that there's no risk of voter fraud in the United States in any real kind of way. But the risk of voter suppression is a real risk. And one party is now determined to suppress the vote because they know that the other way to win votes in the United States is to appeal beyond white people. And while the Republicans are better at getting Hispanic votes than people have estimated in the past, so maybe they may change their minds about suppressing votes in certain parts of Texas. The national energy right now amongst the state level Republican parties, I mean, we talk about the national Republican Party, but the state level Republican parties has been awful. They've been not only changing the right to vote for many Americans, but also when they lose elections, they immediately gut the powers of that person who got elected. That happened to a number of governors 2 years ago after the 2018 election, and it's happening now. And one of the fundamental characteristics of democracy, the defining characteristic of democracy, is being willing to lose an election and tolerating that and working for the next one. And the Republican Party has been acting as if losing an election is something to be avoided at all costs, And the Democrats don't act that way. Democrats are very used to losing. I spent my life, growing up in the 1980s, where as a Democrat, my votes were largely wasted again and again and again. And then in the mid 90s or late 90s, I was living in Texas, so my votes were being tossed out left and right. Losing is part of the Democratic way of life, big D and small d. And so we've got to accept losing and working for another day. What Fidesz did to help destroy Hungarian democracy was help to take a temporary advantage to game the rules to make those advantages permanent. And the Republicans have been doing the same thing. And so right now, the big debate in the United States is whether do we gut the filibuster in order to get voting rights protected. And to me, it's a no-brainer. Because if you don't get voting rights protected, then it doesn't really matter whether you can filibuster or not, because in 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 years, you're going to be stuck with something that ain't a democracy at all.
Thank you very much. That was a terrific panel. We have to actually end it there. Really, I want everybody to give our panelists a round of applause for terrific and thought-provoking presentations. Before we do sign off totally, I'm going to pass it to Laurel Weldon, who's going to make a short announcement about our next event. Laurel?
Yeah, before you sign off, I just want to say, first of all, thank you to our panelists and to the audience for a fantastic set of presentations and a discussion. If we had twice as much time, we still wouldn't be able to scratch the surface of this really fascinating topic. But we also wanted to point out to you our next event in the series, which is going to be a talk by Al Tillery of Northwestern University entitled "The Performance of Power: Black Lives Matter and American Democracy." Come out Friday, April 16th at 10 in the morning Pacific time. 10 in the morning Pacific time for Al's talk. I expect it will be really interesting. So thanks again to everybody for this fantastic conversation. Thank you again to our panelists, and thanks to the audience, and hopefully you'll come out to the next talk. Thanks a lot, everyone.